I am so thrilled to welcome you here to our beautiful new Performing Arts Center for the CIT conference. You speak about inclusive leadership, and I think that the CIT conference is really an example of SUNY at its best. People working together to solve problems, to think differently, to think new about how do we serve students. It's a great pleasure for me to invite you here to Potsdam. I know it's very far for many of you, in fact, for all of you except for our colleagues at Canton, and thank you for being here. We hope you find it worth the visit. You don't stumble on Potsdam, but our aim is for when you, right, you don't come here by accident, do you, unless you're trying to make it to Ottawa. But our aim is to make you comfortable when you're here and to provide the kind of environment in which you can have those enriching, thrilling discussions that leave you excited about the classroom and that leave you excited about what you're doing on your campuses. I never lose an opportunity, at least this year, to remind folks that it's our 200th birthday. We have been working for 200 years to enhance student learning and teaching. And so I think it's fitting that you are here helping us do that this year. I also never lose an opportunity, as Romine Prescott will attest, to remind people whenever they come to campus that SUNY Potsdam is #1 in the SUNY system for food service. And yes, thank you. And the rule of our campus is that you cannot leave the campus hungry. So I am thrilled to invite you here to eat, to enjoy each other's stimulating conversation, to enjoy the talk that we're about to hear. It's an extraordinary opportunity for Potsdam to show you, I think, and to invite you into SUNY at its best. So thank you for being here. Thank you for enjoying our gorgeous weather. Unlike Romine, I don't say it's sunny here all the time. I say it's beautiful here all the time. And I think mud is beautiful, sun is beautiful, rain is beautiful. But the Performing Arts Center is a wonderful place in which to have a wonderful conversation about the future of distance learning, about the future of technology and learning, and about how we learn best and how we facilitate learning best. So again, thank you for being here and welcome to Potsdam.
And we're very grateful for her welcoming words. I've certainly enjoyed the food here and intend to do so throughout my stay. It is an honor, a pleasure, a privilege, and any other incredibly large word that I can think of, to introduce our keynote speaker today, Dr. David Wiley, Chief Academic Officer of Lumen Learning. Dr. Wiley's well known for his interest in increasing student success, so we certainly share his goal there in improving affordability of student education and for open educational resources. All of us understand how important it is for our schools, for our students, for our country, for the world, to make sure that we are educating young people in a way that will allow them to make informed decisions to the benefit of other citizens of the world. So it is particularly important that our keynote speaker today will be addressing those issues. Dr. Wiley.
Well, let me start by saying amen to that. I might not have the most serious tone throughout the entire talk, but I don't want to lose that thread, that there really is some very, very serious work that we're about, and I appreciate you framing it that way. Thank you very much. Let me start by saying that these slides, this talk is an OER. You're welcome to grab the slides from online and take any parts of them that you like and do a range of things with them. As Janet said, the main hat that I wear is I'm the Chief Academic Officer at Lumen, but also just want to mention two other affiliations, one as an adjunct faculty member at BYU in their graduate program on educational technology, and also as the Education Fellow at Creative Commons, and I'll spend some time talking about Creative Commons in a moment. But I think you should begin every talk with a Tolkien quote of some kind. So here is mine. This is Galadriel, of course, from Lord of the Rings, saying that the world is changed In fact, it would be great if we could say changed in the past tense. We all know that it's changing very rapidly. If I could just point out a handful of specific ways in which it is either changed or still changing. First, a change from things being analog to things being digital, everything from music to phones to TV to newspapers, although I understand that vinyl's making a resurgence in the music scene. But this is definitely the direction that things are moving. From being tethered to being mobile. Can you remember there was a time not that long ago that to talk on your phone, it had to have a stretchy cord that plugged into the wall? To use your phone or to use your computer, it had to be plugged into a wall, into the network. From being stuck in one place to being able to move around, that's a change that we're experiencing. A change from concealing or hiding to really being people more who share. It used to be that all of our photos went into a shoebox, which went into the back of the closet. Now photos go online on Facebook, on Instagram, to Pinterest, and a range of places. From being isolated to being connected. And I think there's a whole semester class hiding out in this one slide here. People are connected to people. People are connected to content. People are connected to systems. Content's connected to content. That's the premise of the web, right? Content connected to other content. Systems to systems. We certainly live in a much more connected world than we did 20 years ago. From things being generic to things being personal. So you don't typically walk into a store and see a computer on a shelf and say, I want to buy that computer, and pick it up and go off with it. Instead, you go online and you configure it. You want this much RAM and this kind of hard drive and this size screen for the monitor. Or when someone's mobile phone goes off, which it undoubtedly will before we're done if we stay long enough, it won't be the default ringtone. It'll be some special ringtone that you or someone who you love chose for your phone, maybe someone smaller than you who you love, and you can't figure out how to put it back. From generic to personal. From consuming to creating. Not that we don't consume anymore, but it used to be, in the cases of newspapers or television, for example, that we really were solely consumers. Now we blog, now we put our own videos on YouTube, now we create in addition to consuming. And certainly a change from things being closed to things being more open. So if we think about the way things used to work then and the way things work now, I think it's sad but true that we can take this slide and we can change the headings of the columns in this fashion to say that there's a way that school tends to work, and then there's the way that the rest of our life works. And unfortunately, school tends to be pretty good at staying still. There's a lot of inertia, and it's a lot of work to fight against some of these other changes. So while we sometimes talk about the digital divide, I'm really more interested in the daily divide, and this difference between our everyday life and our in-school experience. It's the kind of thing that, like when my dad says the word academic, he uses it in sense 2 here in the Google definition, not of practical relevance, of only theoretical interest. This debate has been largely academic, is the quote here. And this is what academic means to a wide range of people, because we don't do a great job of bridging this daily divide. Now, you thought that as a talk about OER, I was going to talk about the cost of higher education, but you guys know about the cost of higher education. I want to come into this conversation through another pathway, through this daily divide pathway. Now, you say, well, David, you're being critical about this daily divide, but what about online learning? What about classes online? My answer to you there would be that was super innovative in '93 when we started doing classes online, and kind of what have you done for me lately? If we think about online classes and this difference between our everyday experience and our in-class experience, yes, online classes obviously are digital. Yes, they're famously mobile. Every one of you, your campus at some point has run an ad with somebody in slippers doing their schoolwork, because that's what it used to be all about. But when you think about online classes, of course, we withhold, we conceal the contents of those classes. If you haven't paid your registration fee, if you haven't been accepted to the campus, you can't see it. Online classes are famously more isolating than face-to-face classes are. Every student in the class is getting the same kind of thing. It's very much a download type of primarily consuming experience, and they're closed. So, how are we going to bridge this daily divide? Let me make an argument about the nature of education for just a second. I think that education is sharing. I think if in the Venn diagram of things, sharing is a large circle and education is a small circle, and I think it fits wholly inside of sharing. I think when you pause to reflect about education is really a matter of sharing what you know, sharing what you can do, sharing feedback with students on work that they provide to you. Once you look at their work as you're providing feedback, hopefully it's not just criticism, but hopefully you're also sharing encouragement with them, persuading them that they are capable, that they can do it, sharing your passion for the discipline, trying to convince them that they want to be economists when they grow up, or whatever your discipline might be. And when you think back about the faculty and the teachers who made a large impact on your life, it's at its best, education is about you sharing something of yourself. Now, hold that thought for a moment and let's talk briefly about the internet. Because the internet, it turns out, has really had a radical impact on our ability to share, right? If you think about books and the cost of sharing a book, or maybe making a new copy of a book so that you can give it to someone else as a gift, from the days when we had to handwrite copies of every book, which it turns out if you search the internet, you can still find people who will hand copy books for you, because you can find anything on the internet. From the days when books had to be handwritten to the printing press to today, this cost of creating a copy of a book now is approaching zero. The cost of sending it anywhere around the world is approaching zero. And that gives us a really unprecedented capacity to share compared to what we've been capable of doing previously. And inasmuch as education is a kind of sharing, I think that the internet gives us an unprecedented capacity to do education, except that it doesn't. So this is the time for my corny morality story. So once upon a time, now see if we could get that disco ball turned on. Right now would be the perfect time to do it. Once upon a time, I want everybody to pause and look. There's a pre-hung disco ball that is pre-lit right there, just waiting to be turned on. You thought I was kidding. I was not. Once upon a time, there was a beautiful land with fields of flowers, and it was lovely, and people lived there, and it was great. But it was very hard to get from here to there. Not that folks in Postdam would understand that, but it was a long way across the kingdom. And one day, this brilliant young person invented the automobile. And he was very proud of his invention to let people get from here to there much more quickly, and you could visit family, and you could go trade. And it was great, except that it had a negative impact on the fair land. So the people got together and they said, look, this automobile thing is great. We want to take advantage of it, but we can't have it tearing up the countryside all the time. So here's what we'll do. We're going to make a compromise. We'll take some of these places, we'll pave them, we'll sacrifice a specific number of things, we'll call them roads, and we'll pass a law that says all the things with engines that go from here to there, whether it's a car or a truck or a motorcycle or whatever it is, it's awesome, but it must stay on the road. And with this compromise, we'll be able to get here to there faster, and we'll be able to preserve what we love about our beautiful kingdom. So that was great. Well, a few decades later, a young woman came up with another invention that she called the airplane. And it was going to get people even faster around the kingdom. She's super excited about this idea. And the night before the maiden voyage of her airplane, the police showed up at her house to tell her, we're very excited about this idea. We think that eventually, it can turn into something really useful, but we just want to remind you that the law is very clear. All the things with engines that go from here to there must stay on the road. That's what the law says, and please do that or we'll be back. So here's a case of modern technology running into this kind of old-fashioned law that didn't really foresee the possibility of air travel. Now, what's the point? The point is that long before the internet was a gleam in an engineer's eye, there was this thing called copyright. And we can come back to this slide from before, and it turns out that the things the internet is particularly good at enabling are the things that copyright specifically regulates: making copies, distributing copies. In fact, one way of thinking about this is that everything that the internet enables us to do from a technical perspective, copyright regulates our ability to do legally, forbidding us if we don't have specific permission. So as educators, and as somebody who's full-time faculty for 15 years in a graduate program on instructional technology, you very much do feel like you've got this great technology that the law is requiring you to kind of drive down the road. There's so many other things you could be doing that you can't. So that brings me to open educational resources. Now, importantly, maybe the most important part of the talk, if you want to sleep through the rest of the talk, maybe that's okay. But what do we mean by open? There's 1,000 opens. Which open are we talking about? Critically, open does not just mean free. The entire internet is already free. If free was all we meant, there'd be nothing special about open educational resources. CNN is free, The Times is free, National Geographic is free, The Guardian, BBC are free. You can go anywhere, and the whole internet, essentially, is free. Open educational resources doesn't mean just free. Open educational resources means free plus permissions. Specifically, when you think about the open in open educational resources, I hope you will apply this two-part test. Free to access, free and unfettered access. I don't have to give up an email address. I don't have to give up my zip code. I don't have to create an account to penetrate some barrier between me and the resources. And in addition to being free, a grant, a formal legal grant of what we call the 5R permissions. The 5R permissions being retain, reuse, revise, remix, and redistribute. So retain means that I can make my own copy that I own, I control, it never deletes itself, it never times out, its password never expires, no one can reach onto my device and remove it. It's my copy that belongs to me. I can use it in a wide range of ways. I can open it up, make changes and improvements to it. I can take two of them and put them together to make something new. That's what remix is about. And then importantly, I can take either my verbatim copy or my revised copy or my new mashed up thing, and I can share it with others. If I don't have those 5 permissions, then whatever it is I'm talking about might be awesome, but it's not OER. It doesn't meet the criteria of free and unfettered access and perpetual irrevocable permissions. Now, inasmuch as this is a legal grant of permissions that we need to formally extend to other people, we do that by copyright licenses. So I hope that many of you are familiar with the Creative Commons licenses. If you're not, I'd encourage you to go to creativecommons.org to learn more about that. And during the Q&A, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have about Creative Commons as well. But I do want to say, I just want to pause for a moment. In the age of Netflix and the age of Hulu and the age of Spotify, and say a word in honor of retain. It seems like the digital world and the purveyors of content in the digital world really want us to move to a model where we access things but we never own things, where we have to pay every month, or if you're the library, you have to renew your subscription every year, and the day you stop paying is the day that you don't have access to things anymore. You can see from their perspective why fee-based access is a far superior model to me being able to own something. If I can own a book or own a CD, I can do a wide range of things with it. But if I'm only licensing access to material, they can set the terms of access, they can set what I'm allowed to do and not allowed to do, and they can take away my access either by going out of business or by being bought by someone else, or they can raise the monthly fee till I'm not willing to pay it anymore. And then all the money that I've paid to Netflix over the last several years, the month I stop paying, I don't have anything. There's a bit of an attack on the idea of private property going on that I think we ought to be paying attention to, particularly in the case of educational materials, where we think students might, at some point in the future, want to refer to this again. Retain, obviously, is a prerequisite for both revise and remix. If I can't make my own copy, I certainly can't make changes, can't make improvements, can't make localizations or mashups. So, once again, these are the 5 R's. When I say open during the course of the presentation, this is what I will mean. And I really hope, in all seriousness, if this is the only thing that you take away from my presentation this morning, it should be this. In the open and open content, the open and open educational resources, the open and open source, the open and open knowledge, the open and open data, if you do a survey of this community of use, the word open has a very specific meaning, and it means these 2 things: free and unfettered access and a grant of permissions. Now, I wish I could take credit for the term FOPEN, but I can't. This is someone else's term. And it means fake open. It means when people use the word open, but what they actually mean is materials that are free, probably that you have to create an account to gain access to, and that are certainly controlled under all rights restricted type of copyright license, and maybe additional terms of use that further restrict what you're capable of doing. We very much want to encourage open, and we very much want to, in some sense, fight the good fight against this idea of fake open. One way of thinking about this in terms of a framework that might reach out to you, and maybe this will be a little provocative and we can talk about it in the discussion. But when you think about cost to students and you think about the permissions that are granted to students and to faculty, commercial textbooks, of course, are expensive and restrictive. The resources that our library spends so much money on, for me as a student, to me they're free for me to use, but as a student or as a faculty member, I don't have retain permissions or revise permissions or remix permissions or redistribute permissions. Whereas with open educational resources, they're both free for me to use, and I have this broad grant of permissions. So, this is what we mean by the open and open educational resources, free and unfettered access, and this grant of permissions. So, coming back to the metaphor in the story, when I take traditionally copyrighted materials and I use those in either my online class or I use them in a blended way in my face-to-face class, I really am driving an airplane down the road. I have this great technology in the internet, but I'm largely restricted by what I'm capable of doing legally. But open educational resources, openly licensed materials, plus the internet, allow me to finally get that thing in the air, because what you will notice is that everything the internet enables us to do technically, open educational resources give us permission to do from a legal perspective. That's, as people who care about instruction and technology, very, very powerful idea. So, let me talk about OER adoption for a few minutes. And when I say, here I am defining terms all over the place like a thesis defense. When I say OER adoption, this is what I mean. I mean, whatever class I'm teaching on the syllabus where it says required materials, whatever used to be there, I'm replacing that with something that is OER. That's what I mean by OER adoption. Not supplemental resources, not suggested secondary resources, actually replacing the core materials we used to require students to buy with materials that are open. I want to talk about an idea that we at Lumen have been thinking about for a long time now, about high-impact OER adoption, which are adoptions that improve affordability, improve student success, and does so at scale. So for those of you who came for the cost part of the talk, here we go. There are a million of these slides. I love this one from The Economist. You're familiar with many that look exactly the same. My favorite way of thinking about the price of textbooks for students is in this context, coming back to Netflix and Spotify again. in a world of only streaming access and not ownership. I can pay for a subscription to Netflix and to Spotify, which will give me 15 million songs and 20,000 movies and TV shows. Together, 1 month of access to that costs less than 1 month of a digital rental of a textbook. 15 million songs, 20,000 movies and TV shows here, 1 textbook here. That's how students experience the cost. Right? If you had $20 a month, which would you rather do? You know the answer. And it's the same answer for your students as well. And many times $20 a month is about all they have. There's a direct relationship between the cost of textbooks and student success. These data are getting a little stale now. We're about to release some new statewide data from Utah in another month or two. But the results will look very much the same here. This is from the Florida Virtual Campus Survey. About 15,000 students responding from across the state of Florida. Over 60% at some point don't purchase textbooks because of their cost. But if you skip down there 4 bullets, 23% regularly go without textbooks because of their cost. So as a faculty member, as you're preparing just for class, keeping in mind that idea that somewhere between 1 out of 4 and 1 out of 5 students are coming into class without a book, without having done the reading. Or maybe they got the reading done because they're able to go hang out at the library and wait for the 1 copy that you had on reserve to come available, or they're fighting some kind of fight with regard to this. They take fewer classes, they don't register for classes, they drop out of classes because of the cost of textbooks. So the idea that we could replace this situation with material that is both free and openly licensed, giving us those permissions, that's in some ways kind of the shortest, easiest part of this conversation. That's a no-brainer. Open educational resources save students so much money. But what does it do to student success? Because even Grumpy Cat knows you get what you pay for, right? I'm finally willing to concede that, yes, there may be openly licensed materials available online, but you get what you pay for. I mean, there's no way that students can learn as much from some Frankenstein hacked together collection of openly licensed free stuff as they can from this beautiful $200 hardback, glossy paper, full color experience that publishers are providing to them. So, I promised Nancy I was going to drink my water. Thanks. Let me talk about a couple of research studies we've recently done, looking at this very question. So the first, this is in JCHE last year. There's the title. I won't read it to you. That would violate the first rule of PowerPoint if I read directly off the slide. It's not a small study, right? It's 16,000 students across 10 different institutions across the United States. Quasi-experimental design. So if this were a different group, we might talk more about propensity score matching, which is super cool and makes your control group and your treatment group very much more like apples and apples instead of apples and oranges. But we're looking at the rate at which students complete courses, the rate at which they receive a C or better, the number of credits they enrolled in this term and next term. Because we had some survey data suggesting when you ask students, what do you do with the money that you saved when your faculty member didn't ask you to buy a $150 textbook? Students said, oh, I take more courses. Really? Because I'm pretty sure you're spending it at Papa John's, but it's an empirical question, right? We can go look and we can find out. And looking across, 3 different covariates in terms of age and gender, and this is the table, the outcomes table from the paper. And so what you can see here, am I working? Yeah, there we go. You can see, that completion and C- or better, these are binary, either you did or you didn't, so these are chi-square kind of analysis. And then on the far right-hand side here, we have, what was your course grade, what was your final grade, just kind of on a GPA scale of 0 to 4. And what you see here is that mainly you see no significant difference, right? That's what all these NSs are. No significant difference when students are asked to buy a $200 or $150 textbook versus when they're assigned to use OER. But you also see a lot of blue boxes, in which case the treatment group, which is the OER users, actually outperform the control group, who are the commercial textbook users. But there are these two up here where the control group outperformed the treatment group, and that was weird. That prompted the next study I'm going to talk about. But let's just pause and reflect here and look at, of all the cells in these 3 columns of data here, in all but 2 of them, OER win, right? If I get no difference in learning for significantly less money, that's a win. If I get more learning for significantly less money, that kind of seems unbelievable. Credits taken is super interesting. Look at this. In fall, which is the semester when students were assigned OER to use instead of commercial textbooks, these students who took OER, who had OER assigned in at least one class, took over 2 credits more than the other students. And even falling into winter term, they took another 1.5 credits more. Now that could be explained a bunch of different ways, and this is certainly not establishing causality with this quasi-experimental design, but this does lend a little bit of credence to what students were telling us on their surveys, that they took that money they saved on textbooks and reinvested it in taking more courses. This next study isn't out yet. It should be out kind of any day now. It's been accepted in Erodal. And this is one that we did together with faculty from Tidewater Community College, where the Z degree is. And this is looking at this metric that we're calling the course throughput rate. And really what the course throughput rate is, the idea is, of the students that are there on the first day of class, how many of them are still there at the end of class receiving a C or better final grade? There's this kind of gauntlet that students have to run. They have to not drop. They have to survive the drop deadline. They have to survive the withdrawal deadline, and they have to end up with a final grade that's a C or higher. So in the case of this particular study at Tidewater, we broke these up into face-to-face courses and online courses. And it was pretty interesting what we found. In the face-to-face courses, where we're comparing on the left-hand side sections of the same courses using commercial materials, and on the right-hand side, parallel sections using OER, the drop rate is a little bit higher for commercial materials. The withdrawal rate's a little bit higher for commercial materials. The C or better rate was a little bit lower for commercial materials. But when you aggregate all those together, when you pull all of that through and say, how many of my students who were here on the first day survived the whole course and ended up with a C or better, it's a 6-point difference in favor of OER. And it's completion with a C or better that keeps students moving forward, moving toward graduation. Interestingly, when we look at this online, the specific numbers are a little different. There's a bigger difference in drop and a smaller difference in withdraw, and the C or better is a little different. But look at that. There's still oddly enough, a 6-point spread between online sections using OER and online sections using commercial materials. And this is there are about 30,000 students in the face-to-face and about 3,000 students in the online. Here's the scale of the study. So again, some pretty interesting evidence in favor of OER. And this has new data in it post the study. This study was originally published in EDUCAUSE Review. And this is college math at Mercy College before and after they went to OER. And you can see at the bottom here how much OER was being used. In fall of 11, there was no OER. In spring of 11, they went to some OER. That went so well that going forward, they started using all OER. And this is broken into fall and spring. Why? It's broken into fall and spring because, as you can see, in math, everybody comes in fall, they take the class, some of them fail and come back in spring. And spring's a very different group of people than the people who are there in fall, because they're largely the people who failed in fall. But in every case, you can see that OER is doing a little better. I wasn't involved in the publication of this paper, but this paper stopped somewhere around here. But you can see now from the last time that Juju presented this presented this slide, that by fall of 14, or by spring of 14, it's 60% jump in passing rates in college algebra. And then just one more, so there are clear benefits on the student side, but let's step back and ask a question about the institutional impact as well. This is another from Tidewater, this time with the provost as one of the co-authors. Looking at the idea of the impact on institutional revenue of OER adoption. And basically, this is the kind of takeaway idea from the study, that the study projected that based on the changes in drop rates, that every year, that every year Tidewater would be holding on to 182 people who would have previously dropped and had their tuition refunded, who now wouldn't drop going forward. And so you take that number of students and multiply it times the percentage of them that are in-state versus out-of-state and how much they pay per credit hour times the total number of credits. And Tidewater, by making this degree-wide move to OER, is looking to hold on to over $100,000 of tuition revenue that they had previously refunded to students who were dropping before the add-drop deadline and were receiving this refund. So in addition to improving student outcomes, it's improving financial outcomes for the institution. My colleague, John Hilton, who's a member of our research group at BYU, is the Open Ed group here, runs this project that we call the Review Project, that includes all of an overview of all the empirical studies of impact on student outcomes that we're aware of. Currently, there's 11 peer-reviewed studies there covering about 50,000 students, and the overall finding across all these studies is that 93% of those students have the same or better academic outcomes, whatever the outcome, whether it's completion or grades or credits enrolled, whatever outcome was being looked at, 93% of them have the same or better outcomes. And in 9 peer-reviewed studies of perceptions of OER quality covering 4,500 faculty and students, about 85% of faculty and students say that their perceived quality, the perceived quality of OER is the same or better than the commercial materials that they were using before they went to OER. Sometime when you're having trouble sleeping, I invite you to visit this website, which I created. It's essentially kind of like an interactive calculator for looking at what adopting OER will do or could do on your campus. So it starts out with a bunch of institutional settings, like what's the average cost of the textbook you're replacing, how many students will be using them, are you going to institute some kind of support fee? A lot of institutions have like a $5 or $10 support fee that they put on these courses to sustain the OER work that they're doing. Percentage of students that are paying in-state tuition. It's basically all the kind of variables I was going through in those previous studies, and you can just kind of dial those around until they look like your campus and the kind of initiative that you're thinking about. And then there's some research-based settings at the bottom. Percentage of students that will be receiving a C or better, the additional percentage of students that will receive a C or better after you go to OER, the change in the drop rate, things like that. They're defaulted to the findings from our research, but if you think they're too conservative, you can dial them up. If you think they're too aggressive, you can dial them down. And as you move these sliders around and set these variables to look like whatever the conditions at your institution look like, then all of these figures on the side will update automatically to show you how much money students will save as a result of your initiative, what are the percentage of students who are there on day one that will earn a C or better. I really love this graph, this learning outcomes per dollar, which charts the dollar amount of that you're asking students to spend on materials against the percentage of students that complete with a C or better. It is kind of interesting to see these cases like, I'm not sure what this one is actually. But anyway, here's somebody being asked to pay $90 for a book, and here's somebody that's in a course with a $5 OER support fee on it, and there are more people succeeding at $5 than there were at $90, and it's kind of interesting to think about it in that way. We think about return on investment in a lot of different contexts, but for some reason it never occurs to us to think about it in terms of the materials we ask students to buy. So it is possible, I hope I've at least started to persuade you that it is possible to use OER in ways that are at least as effective, if not more effective, than what we're currently doing. But how does that play out? So let me give 3 kind of very high-level ideas about how that might play out. The first is don't stop at the swap. An example of what I mean by don't stop at the swap. How many of you owned this phone? Be honest. Like everybody owned this phone, right? And then at some point, you went from owning this phone to owning this phone. And for some period of time, all that you did with this phone was make phone calls and send text messages. Because that's all you ever did. Like, what else do you do with a phone? A phone is for making calls and sending text messages. And the idea that you could send email, or you could listen to music, or you could take pictures, it kind of takes a while to wrap your head around. And so in the same way, I guess, when I say don't stop at the swap, what I mean is when you change from commercial textbooks to using OER, don't do the same things with OER that you used to do with restrictive commercial textbooks. Take advantage of those 5R permissions that are granted to you to make some changes, to make some improvements, to do some things. The second is to use outcomes as outline. And we've all had the experience where we've found the best book we could possibly find by whatever metric it is that you want to judge, and there are 6 extra chapters in it that we have no intention of teaching. Or the best book we can find actually doesn't cover 2 things that we really desperately want to teach, so we assign a second book, or something like this. With open educational resources and the idea that they're meant to be taken apart and recombined, revised, remixed, you can just build a table of contents for your own set of course materials that are the learning outcomes on your syllabus. Outcome 1, outcome 2, outcome 3. And you can say, for this outcome, this is how I'm going to assess it in this way. And to prepare students to succeed in demonstrating to me that they've learned something, here are the kind of experiences I want them to have. I want them to watch this video. I want them to read this chapter. I want to do whatever. And it's the most basic instructional design model you could possibly imagine, sometimes called backward design. Anybody familiar with that phrase, backward design? Nobody laughed when I said backward design, so I wondered. Backward design because it's actually the way we should do it, but nobody ever actually does it that way. But with open educational resources, you can actually do it this way. You can start with your outcomes. You can pick assessments. You can pick different activities, different pieces of content that you want students to use in different ways. And you just line them up straight across. Our first example with this was working in K-12 in Utah on a science project there that with the state office going through from middle school and up into high school, and bring teachers together for a 2-day professional development kind of thing in late January, early February. And we just laid down, here are the state standards for science, here's what everybody needs to know, and then supported them in a process of going through and looking at and evaluating and choosing and aggregating open educational resources around each of those outcomes. And in their case, Utah is not a one-to-one state. It's just every state likes to claim that they have the lowest per pupil funding in K-12. Utah actually has the lowest per pupil funding in K-12 anywhere in the country. So we're not buying laptops for everybody. And they decided they wanted to do this in a print-on-demand kind of way. And as soon as they started doing print, anyway, we ended up in a situation where we needed the state office to do a formal review of these materials that the teachers had pulled together because they wanted to use them as the primary instructional materials for the courses. And this materials review process normally, I guess, takes a couple of days. And so as that all came together, the review group got together and they picked up this book that these teachers had created, and they opened it up, and there were all the state standards. They said, well, is standard 1 covered? Yes. Is standard 2 covered? Yes. It was apparently like the shortest review ever in the history of materials review because the table of contents was the learning outcomes. There wasn't any dancing around. There wasn't any extra material. There wasn't anything that wasn't covered. If you grab a hold of this opportunity to take the outcomes off your syllabus and do a little choosing and aggregating, you can create exactly what you want. And then finally, and maybe most excitingly from the instructional design perspective, I think, is about rethinking the way that you do your assessments, and specifically asking the question, what is it that open allows me to do that not open doesn't allow me to do? So let me come back to this daily divide notion for a moment. And focus in specifically on this kind of bottom right-hand quadrant of things that typical online learning, typical online classes don't get us to. Connecting. You can't connect to something that you don't have access to. It'd be great if I could put a link in my course that took you back to that course you took last semester so you can go study up on that topic again as you get ready to do this in my class, but you're unenrolled, maybe the Blackboard shell is turned off, or maybe it got put into cold storage or something. When I don't have access to something, I can't connect you to it. I can't personalize something that I don't have permission to make any changes to, and I certainly don't have any incentive to do a lot of creating or remixing or sharing if I'm afraid I'm going to get sued for doing so. So when you can assume open, right here, all of these things, all these problems go away. I can connect now because I know there's access. I can share. I can have students engaged in creating. And it's particularly the creating, not consuming, and the personal, not generic piece that I think is interesting in the context of our assessments. Some of you will have heard me rail against this idea of disposable assessments before. The definition of a disposable assessment is an assessment, any task you ask students to do where there's an implicit understanding that they will do the work, I will grade the work, and then they will throw away the work. And honestly, the garbage can is the ultimate destiny of the overwhelming majority of things we ask students to do. Students don't particularly like doing them. I don't know about you. I don't particularly enjoy grading them. And if you stop and think about it for a moment, it seems like it's a bit of a wasted opportunity. A little back of the envelope math using some Department of Education data. My best guess is that undergraduates collectively spend about 40 million hours a year doing homework. Now, when you think about it in that frame, it seems like, oh my gosh, imagine, like, what could you do if you could direct, which you can because you're assigning grades, and so students typically do the work we set for them. If you could direct 40 million hours worth of effort, doesn't it seem like there's something we could accomplish there? So I want to talk just briefly about the idea of a renewable assessment, an assessment that a student would actually see value in doing, one that you might even potentially enjoy grading, and that would add some value to the world at the end of the process. Value beyond the student's learning. I don't want to downplay student learning, but I think you'll see the argument I'm trying to make here in a moment. So a couple of examples kind of from my own practice. The first is an example of a course I taught many years ago. This was 2007, maybe. This was a graduate course in educational technology. Anybody remember learning objects? Yeah, right? Learning objects were going to be the thing. They were going to solve all of our problems. So I was teaching this graduate seminar on learning objects, and the experience I really wanted my students to have was I wanted to get together this group of people, like the vice president of an educational software company, an open source zealot, kind of instructional designer from a Center for Teaching and Learning. I wanted to get a bunch of people together around a conference room table, and I wanted to have them argue or at least talk about specific topics. And I wanted my students to be able to listen in on that conversation. I wanted them to be able to get these different perspectives. And I realized I wasn't going to be able to persuade all those people to come together regularly. And I honestly don't remember how, but at some point I decided the right way to replicate that experience for my students was to basically write a sitcom. There's your phone ringing. Was to basically write a sitcom where I did kind of 15 episodes, one episode per week, of these people sitting down and having the conversation I wanted them to have. And my wife thought I was completely going crazy. She'd walk past my office. I'd be sitting there laughing, and she'd be like, what happened? What's so funny? And I said, oh my gosh, you won't believe what Victor just said in the, in the thing I'm writing because I'm so hysterical. So I took these kind of little scripts, which were the primary assigned readings for the course, and threw them in a wiki because I was sure that I had misspelled things and I had grammar problems or punctuation problems or things like that. And so I threw them in a wiki and gave all the students accounts on the wiki and said, as you find things when you're going through the reading, please fix them. So I did that writing over the summer, and then came back and, over the weekend I would read the reading I had previously written for students that week that we're going to be talking about in class. And about the third week of class, I sat down that weekend to read what I had written, and there was a character in my sitcom that I didn't recognize. And one of the students who was a K-12 teacher had decided that there is an important K-12 kind of perspective to be brought to bear on this conversation. And so she clicked the edit tab, and instead of fixing my punctuation, just added a new character and started writing her in, through the readings. And of course, this is not at all what I was expecting the students to do. And this taught me, probably most powerfully, I think, this experience, that of all the things that openness does, openness facilitates the unexpected. When you give people permission to do things, they will do things that will surprise you, will amaze you, will delight you, will occasionally terrify you. But Tina, the name of the teacher character, didn't show up in every episode of the sitcom for the rest of the term, but she did come back regularly. And I thought it was kind of the coolest thing that I'd ever been a part of, that there was a student who was writing for and contributing to the core materials that was being assigned to the students to read for class. That seemed really interesting to me. And of course, that's only possible because the whole wiki has an open license on it, and it's okay for somebody to click the edit tab and start working on that. So I started exploring this idea more, like, if you can have students actually co-create the core materials you're going to assign to other students to read, now what kinds of things can we do? I'm going to play a little clip of this video for you. This is from an assignment that I call my Kung Fu assignment. I think it's my favorite renewable assignment. I call it the Kung Fu assignment because any Jackie Chan fans in the room, like not like Shanghai Nights, like old good Jackie Chan. Yeah, you're feeling me. All right. Those old Kung Fu movies, when you watch them, the defining characteristic of those old Kung Fu movies is that the dubbing is always out of sync with the people's mouths, right? So the idea of the Kung Fu assignment is you go find some old video that's in the public domain, which means it's free and that you have those 5R permissions for it, or you find some modern video that's explicitly openly licensed, and you dub new audio over top of it to make it talk about whatever principle it is that you need to be talking about. So this is in a class on new media and learning. This is old enough now that new media included blogs and wikis at the time. And this could have very easily been a 2 to 5 page compare and contrast, tell me what's the difference between blogs and wikis kind of assignment. But instead, it was a Kung Fu assignment. So what we have here is a debate, some old debate footage of Kennedy and Nixon. You will see here that Kennedy's on the side of wikis and Nixon is on the side of blogs. It'll become obvious why that's true in just a moment. Can you hear that in the back?
As web communication and collaboration tools evolve, the distinction between wikis and blogs has become subtle at the outset and greater as the use deepens, like a fork in the road. Blogs and wikis might not seem that different on first glance because they both enable communication of information by a person or group of people and provide a platform for feedback. Blogs do it in the form of comments, while wikis do it by letters, letting users directly edit the content of a given page. Mr. Kennedy.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me get to the heart of the matter. Wikis are indeed what our people need at this crucial time in the history of our nation.
Thank you. Thank you. I disagree, Mr. Kennedy. Blogs are the way of the future for this nation. A few weeks ago, I created a blog entitled The Watergate Blog. Now, the good thing about these blogs is that you can control the information that's available to the people in the media. You can also keep away internet predators, where a wiki without the proper controls can be very susceptible to their evil ploys. Something my esteemed opponent has failed to disclose to the American people is that wikis are particularly susceptible to the evils of internet predators. Anyone going in and editing the text that is viewed by the children of this nation. In contrast, a blog you can clearly see who said what without compromising the integrity of the content. Furthermore, any comments or postings can be screened by the blog facilitator, and I say to the American people, let me be your blog facilitator.
Well, I respect the views of my worthy opponent, Mr. Nixon. They are utterly unconstitutional. The aforementioned openness of a wiki is a great example of the freedom of speech that we get from a wiki. The voice of the people should not be suppressed. Not only are blogs rigid, but they are unconstitutional in that they do not allow for freedom of speech. Mr. Nixon, how do you answer to recently publicized charges that you pay people to put positive comments on your blog?
I am not a crook. Two can play at this game. What about the scandalous and inappropriate comments reported to be found on your wiki, Mr. Kennedy? While the voice of the people should certainly not be suppressed, any comment found on your site can be seen as something you support. But do you, the American people, want that content to be identified as something as you support? Do you want to open your beliefs, your convictions, and have them to be at the mercy of the critical masses?
Now we know what you think of the American people, Mr. Nixon.
Any final comments, Mr. Kennedy?
In closing, I want the people of this nation to know that with a wiki, your voice will be heard. I will ensure that everyone has access to every wiki. Let me be the warrior of your wiki. Ask not what your wiki can do for you, but what you can do for your wiki.
Thank you for coming to tonight's program. We hope you have a great evening.
Ask not what your wiki can do for you, but what you can do for your wiki. Now, all of us have been to conferences where at the end the organizers say, this has been so great, we don't want it to die, we want to keep the conversation going on, so we've set up a wiki for the conference. And then, typically nothing happens. This idea, this ask not what your wiki can do for you, but what you can do for your wiki, goes right to the heart of what it is that's interesting about wikis, right? And the interplay back and forth about blogs and blog facilitation and comments, and if you don't have appropriate controls on your wiki, lots of good issues raised, lots of argument and debate here. So fun to work with these guys on the script, so fun to give them perfect marks when they finally finish. This homework assignment has been viewed 52,000 times. Right? There are people in other programs that when they teach about blogs and wikis, they have people come watch this video as one of the things they ask their students to do. And like I said, this could very easily have been a two-page compare and contrast kind of essay that they could have done, and they would have been bored writing it, and I would have been bored reading it, and we all could have kind of done our thing and thrown the essay away. But I think there are opportunities now, like with these old public domain videos, right? They're free, and you have the 5R permissions. This is an open educational resource to engage students in remixing, in creating, and not just creating stuff, but creating things that will have value for students in the next iteration of the course that we can include in the required readings or the required assignments. Perhaps a little more boringly, I should have saved the Kung Fu one for last because it's my favorite one. I used to teach a class called Project Management for Instructional Designers. And of course, there is no textbook called Project Management for Instructional Designers. But we did find an old open textbook on project management written specifically for the business school context. And it was full of examples about the logistics of getting so much rebar and so much concrete to Singapore at the same time. Something that I didn't care about, my students didn't care about. And I looked at this book and I thought, this is so close to what we need. So frustrating. I'd really like to use an open textbook for this class. I just don't have the energy to go through and do all the things in this book that need to be, hey, wait a minute. I'll have the students do it, right? I'll have them make all the changes to the book that need to be made to turn it into a project management for instructional designers kind of book. So every time I taught this class, after that, I broke the students into small groups. I let them choose to be in groups of 2 or 3. And then they would identify, they would propose, here's the specific kind of change we'd like to make to the book. And so, that very first year, students went through and found all the little yellow boxes that had the little example case study things in them, pulled those all out, and rewrote new ones to go in there. Now, as you stop and think about that for a minute, it takes a pretty good understanding of the principles being discussed to write an exemplary case study to go in there. So that's pretty good work. Another group of students who was really interested in video said, we want to go around and shoot, we want to do interviews with practicing project managers who manage ID projects, and what we'll do is we'll talk to them, we'll interview them about every topic, every major kind of chapter name. We'll ask them questions about those things. And so now as you move through the table of contents in this book, it starts with this set of 3 video vignettes with real practicing project managers talking about some time when mismanaging the people side of the project blew the project up. Probably the most devious, and I think in some ways my favorite example of a change that students made to this book is there's a thing called the Project Management Professional, the PMP certificate. And the average salary for someone with a PMP certification is $106,000 a year. So this is something I would say on the first day of class to try to get everybody to actually care about this required course they had to take in our program. But it turns out that the materials that you can get to prepare to take that exam are all $300 giant, test prep books like you've seen before. So the students a group of students got together, went over to the library, checked out all the PMP certification exam books they could find, went through and looked and found out how many questions on each topic, how do they approach exam preparation, et cetera, and then revised this book so that now this open textbook can be used to prepare for the certification exam. Just awesome, right? The kind of stuff that if you tell them, hey, I'm open, like you guys get in groups, propose changes that you want to make, and some of them won't be great, and we can kind of iterate through them. But honestly, your weekly assignment week to week is going to be standing up in class and reporting back on the improvements and changes that you've made up to that point. And it gets to be kind of a play within a play, because in a project management class, we're actually managing projects, and the projects are rewriting the project management book. So it gets kind of meta really fast. But anytime you give students the opportunity to do this kind of good work that they see is going to have value beyond the class and stand up and talk in front of other people, to give project reports, to talk about what they're doing, boy, I mean, you almost don't even have to worry about assigning grades anymore, because all the groups are trying to outdo each other. They're trying to do the coolest thing or the funniest thing or the smartest thing. And the work that gets done is amazing, and they love it. And I ask the students in this class all the time, on the last day of class, ask them, was your grade in this class ever in doubt? Was that ever really like something that you thought about or worried about? And they said, no. And I said, was there any other class you took this semester that you spent more time on than this class? And then they'd get this look on their face like, I've been snookered. How did you do that to me? Like I killed myself for this class, but I was never worried about my grade. How did you do that to me? That's not fair. You can unlock. Everybody wants to do something that's valuable. Everybody wants to make something that makes a difference of some kind. And as we rethink our assessment strategies in the context of open, right, there are things we can ask students to do where they really can make a genuine difference, and they want to. They want to so badly. I'm not even going to talk about that one. Well, I'll say something really briefly about it. In that you might be interested in it kind of from a professional development perspective. So this is openedreader.org is the URL for this book. And this is on from a graduate course I taught on, in the fall. I teach an Introduction to Open Education class. And we had the students work together. I compiled the readings. And then as a group, okay, I guess I'm talking about it. Then all the students, got blogs and took all of their notes on all the readings publicly on a blog somewhere. And then at the end of the semester, each student assumed responsibility for some number of readings that we'd covered in the class. And that student went through and read everyone's notes. And everyone was taking notes in kind of a structured format, like a summary of the reading, what are the 3 most important points, what's the historical significance of this reading, things like that. So one student went through, kind of aggregated and pulled the best of that together from all the notes all the students had taken, and produced this reader, which now, for what I think are some of the key things you ought to read if you're going to be working in the field of open education. There's a link to the actual article, and all the articles are accessible. All the articles are open. The summary, the high points, historical significance, discussion questions to talk about when you read this book in class, things like that. And all the students that worked on this is pm4id.org is the URL for this book. And the students who've made significant contributions to this book are all listed as co-authors now. And the same thing on the Open Education Reader. The students are all listed as co-authors on that. So the point here is that, there are multiple points, I guess. Renewable assignments are enabled by the fact that there are materials that are open, that give students permission to take them and make these changes and do these kinds of projects. You've probably had some experience like this in the past, either personally or where you've seen students just get on fire about some piece of work that they were doing. They created something that was kind of beyond your wildest dreams. And renewable assignments seem to do that over and over again because they give students the opportunity to make that contribution that everybody wants to make. So that was improving student success. Number 3, doing it at scale. So everybody's familiar with the idea of an OER-based degree, I believe, but just to say a word about it, this is where for a sufficient number of elective classes and all of the required classes in a degree, there's one or more section where OER are assigned instead of commercial textbooks, which makes it possible for a student who's paying attention when they register for classes to go from their first class all the way through graduation without ever being asked to purchase a textbook, because every course they've taken has replaced commercial materials with OER. There are a bunch of these happening around the country. You probably have heard of the Z degree at Tidewater, which was the very first one. There's another set of 2 degrees that came very quickly behind the Tidewater work at Northern Virginia Community College. There's actually an initiative in the state of Virginia right now called Z at 23, where they're trying to create Z degree, at least one Z degree at every community college in the state system, the 23 colleges in the system. This is a slide from a Tidewater presentation looking at the impact of the Z degree on affordability. This is this is in-state tuition cost for their 2-year degree in business administration, and this is the cost of textbooks at the bookstore. And when you replace that with nothing, you shave 25% off the cost to graduate. Now, we all know that the majority of the cost to graduate, at least typically, is in tuition. And it takes an act of God and the legislature and something else to make tuition move. But we are in complete control of the cost of textbooks. We can just choose to use OER instead of using commercial textbooks. And when you get together with other people and make that choice across a degree program, you can literally knock a quarter off the cost to graduate, just 20 of you sitting down and deciding to do it. It's amazing. Now, something that we haven't seen yet that I'm really kind of excitedly waiting to see happen is we haven't seen a 4-year school make a gen ed promise, which is that regardless of what degree you're seeking, there's an all OER pathway through our general education requirements so that every single student who comes to our campus can go at least the first 2 years without ever being asked to buy a textbook. And when you think about these whether you think about it in the context of a 2-year degree or a gen ed promise in a 4-year context, or even in a 2-year context, when you replace textbooks with OER, you essentially give every student at your institution a $1,000 scholarship, right? Without having to raise any money, without having to talk to your development person or whatever. This choice done just by faculty, led by faculty working together with other faculty, supported by instructional designers, supported by librarians, supported by the administration. But this is the kind of thing that we own. Right? We don't own tuition, we can't control things like that. But we can make choices around textbook costs. So, high-impact OER adoption can improve affordability, can improve student success, and can do it at scale. I would be remiss if I didn't invite you to come to Open Ed this year, which is in Richmond, so it's relatively close. November 2 through 4 down in Virginia, the 13th annual Open Education Conference. Looking forward to that. And with that, we have some time for discussion, and I really look forward to hearing your thoughts or disagreements or questions. Thank you. So I don't think we have any roving mics. I'll report questions that you ask if you just want to maybe make yourself known. And yes?
Do you think that by giving students, say, $1,000 scholarship, by not having to buy textbooks, gives legislatures and administration permission to raise tuition, thereby actually creating more equity?
It would give them permission to raise tuition because well, people can find all sorts of reasons to do stupid things. I'm sure that there are 100 different ways that people could twist good choices you would make around OER in kind of ridiculous ways. I don't know that there's any way to prevent that. In the K-12 context, in Utah and in Arizona, we've had a number of conversations about because in those cases, the districts pay for textbooks, right? The institutions are paying for them. Will a switch to OER give the legislature some kind of feeling like they can just fund us less now because we're not purchasing textbooks? And so, we're very proactive getting out ahead of that, saying, now that you're not buying textbooks, oh, look, now there's a fund we can actually buy tablets and laptops with and things like that. And so some proactive messaging around here would be responsible things that you can do with this savings rather than just cutting our budgets further. There are things that you can do proactively to try to help that not happen.
So this is also making certain assumptions about access to technology for students, which many people, as well, most of us here probably don't have smartphones, but for some communities of students, even that is a real stretch. And so I'm wondering if you would talk a little bit about it's great to not have open content, and it creates a world, I think, with the presumption of a certain amount of money being spent on technology while students walking in the door. Or is there a companion discussion about what the baseline ought to be for technology institution when it's available, harvesting the textbook money back, having a fee-based situation so every student coming in is issued an iPad, licensing, and what your thoughts are on that?
Yeah, so yes to all of those things, and I think the answer's different in every context. I don't know if I said this or not when I was talking about the Utah high school stuff earlier, but where that ended up, because we're so poorly funded and every student doesn't have laptops, we do print on demand in Utah, and we do it through an arrangement with, actually I say through an arrangement. There is no special arrangement. We just created an account at CreateSpace, which is the Amazon print on demand service, uploaded PDFs of all the material. And the PDFs are available to download from the state office website if you want to use them digitally. But we can print and ship to the school a high school science textbook for under $5 a pop through CreateSpace. And in the K-12 context, $5 gets you out of the textbook budget and into your supplies budget. And so now you can get around some of the regulatory issues with how textbook money gets spent and what has to be approved and whatnot, because you're going to buy what's essentially a workbook, give it to a kid, you don't expect them to ever give it back to you. Which then enables them to do things like highlight and take notes in the margins and things that when you have a book you're going to hold on to for 10 years, you tell kids they're absolutely not allowed to do, because you're buying a normal textbook and holding on to it until you can replace it again. So there are all kinds of ways to approach it. Sometimes print on demand will be the best option. Sometimes looking at some kind of fee-based scenario where we can guarantee that every student has some baseline level of access to technology if that's not something that they're typically coming with. Those problems, I think, are all very solvable problems, but the solution will be pretty specific to your unique context. Yeah.
So I'm going to ask a question more from an author standpoint.
Sure.
Full disclosure, I'm an author of textbooks.
Awesome.
And spent an inordinate amount of time for the amount of money that I made, and I can't control how much a textbook costs.
Yep.
It bugs me, and I don't ask my students to buy it, and we have a policy that our university, where I make no money off of asking my students to buy a
Yeah.
textbook requirement. So how do you propose compensating the people who write, for instance, those workbooks that you just said your students use to make their own open source one?
Mm-hmm.
And where is the equitability in all of this?
Well, it all depends on what incentivizes you, right? So it's kind of like open source software, right? There are many, many reasons that people decide to create OER. Some people, Preston McAfee is an economics textbook author. I think he's at Berkeley. And I believe the story is that he had previously written some economics textbooks that he'd published with a publisher and felt like his students had just gotten a totally raw deal. And I hope I'm getting the story right, but apparently at some point just decided to thumb his nose at publishers and went back and wrote entire new textbooks and put them on his website and made them available to students just because he was so mad. So being angry or wanting to thumb your nose at someone is one motivation. There are, many, many grants now require that whatever the output of the grant is be licensed under a Creative Commons license so that it becomes OER. So if you receive a grant from a foundation like Hewlett, like the Hewlett Foundation or the Gates Foundation, or a Department of Labor grant, or very soon now a Department of Education grant, then whatever, and you might not write a full textbook, you might just make a couple little simulations for, to teach whatever content area you're working in, or something around advanced manufacturing with your labor grant or whatever, but the grant requires that whatever you make be openly licensed. There are places you can work, like at Lumen Learning. Anything that you make at Lumen that is going to be, it's going to be some kind of educational material, but as an employer, we require you to put an open license on it. So you're getting paid to create open educational resources by your employer. There are a whole range of reasons why you might do it. And some people, Preston's pretty unique in that you can count kind of on two hands the number of people who just kind of out of spite sit down and write a full textbook. Right? Most people write a chapter or they contribute a video. People like Sal Khan or James Sousa who sit down and make 4,000 math videos because they want to are pretty rare. But at the same time, how many people do we need to sit down and make 4,000 math videos? After Khan Academy's done it, after James Sousa's done it, after whoever else does it, how many ways can we, maybe we need 20, maybe we need 30, but think about the number of people that teach college algebra in the country, and if 0.0001% of them feel that motivation, then you're going to end up with 50 videos on every conceivable topic. And then now it becomes a matter of finding the right ones and aggregating them together. There are two sides to the funding question, right? One is who funds the time that I spend doing the work, and then I may or may not be motivated by the idea of royalty payments. Those are two separate things, right? So in the grant context, whether it's a foundation grant or a Department of Labor grant, or you work for Lumen or for OpenStax or someone else, you get paid for the time you spend doing the thing. There's just no royalty payment after, right? And then there are some people who, just for spite, go and do stuff and they don't get paid even to do it, let alone the royalty payment. So there are many different models, as many different motivations as there are people. Some of them get paid, some of them don't get paid at all. And I think the thing that will be really interesting to watch as we roll forward is, what, at the end of the day, okay, I'm stepping onto my soapbox for a moment now. Like, if I wasn't soapboxing before, here I go. For many, many years now, when we've talked about the quality of educational materials, quality in air quotes, we've talked about everything except the effectiveness in supporting student learning of those materials. We've talked about editorial, we've talked about layout, we've talked about the quality of the imagery, we've talked about the 1900 peer reviews or whatever. All these things that we believe to be proxies for effectiveness, right? We wouldn't care about those things if we didn't think that they were going to contribute to student learning in some way. And I'm not saying that they don't contribute to student learning, but I think what the lesson that OER is showing us over and over again is that there are other authoring models, other review models, other ways materials can be produced that can result in materials that are just as effective in supporting student learning as the kind of publishing house model. If you'd see these Utah science textbooks, you'd love them. They do have color covers. But they're 8.5 by 11 kind of, I've got you, you're next. I don't want your arm to fall off. They're 8.5 by 11 kind of normalish paper, black and white on the inside. They're 350, 400 pages long. They don't look high quality. But in a very large study with students across the state looking at their performance on the end-of-year state-administered science exam, we showed that the students who use those books do at least as good, and in some cases better, than the kids who were using the book that had 1,200 peer reviews and photography from National Geographic and whatever else. These proxies for quality that we've historically thought about, we have to accept that there are many paths to the top of Mount Fuji. Here, the Pearson production model is not the only way to get to materials that are effective. Okay, off my soapbox about that now. It is, on the face of it, when you look at like those Utah science books, you'll think these are kind of ghetto-looking kind of books. And yet, at the end of the day, when kids learn more, is that a high-quality book or not? Right? That the only metric that should matter when we talk about the quality of educational materials is the degree to which they support student learning. If they support great student learning, I don't care if they're black and white, or I don't care if there's some punctuation that's missed here or there. If it has all of that stuff, but students learn less when they use that material, how can we call that equally high quality? That's why I only say the word quality in air quotes, because I think it's so loaded with baggage. I think we ought to only talk about effectiveness. Sorry, I drifted a bit from your original question. I apologize. Yes?
Thanks, David, for your whole talk, but also for bringing up open source software. And I'm curious what you think, if any, are the parallels, lessons to be learned, right? Because in open source software, of course, amazing success stories like Linux. There's stories where companies have founded and reborn on open source software, like Apple.
Yep.
The operating system. Then there's also
Yeah. So this is also a semester-long conversation, if it's done well, I think. But just let me make a couple very quick comments, because I see it's about to turn 12 o'clock and I'm supposed to quit. Probably the first and most obvious difference between the two is with a piece of open source software that I might have written and I might maintain, and you want to make an improvement or a change to it, and you might submit a patch to me to say, hey, here's a feature you can add or something like that. In the context of software, I can frequently run some objective test to tell me if your improvement makes my software better or worse. Right? It's going to take it longer to compile. It's going to not compile. It's going to work on fewer operating systems because of the way that you wrote your patch or something. Like, there are some objective tests I can do to say this demonstrably makes this better or worse. And that decision about better or worse can be a kind of universal decision. In the context of open content or open educational resources, it's almost exactly the opposite. Because frequently, some change that you would make that would improve the material for your students will actually make it worse for my students, right? You might take out the examples I've written about Utah and about the high desert and something else, or some reference I make to, Utah's predominantly Mormon, so Mormon metaphors speak really quickly to most of the students in many of the classes. Or you might pull those metaphors out or pull out the references to, you can always tell east and west by just looking to where the mountains are. Or there are things like that that you would pull out and you'd put something else in that would make it speak more directly to your students and make it more confusing for mine. And I think with open source software, there's this idea that people can contribute to one master version that can keep getting better for everyone. And with OER, I think there are cases where improvements can be made to a master version that can make it better for everyone, but I think the majority of the kind of localization, personalization work goes into something that other people like you can benefit from, but that actually make it worse for the majority of people, if that makes sense. So I think that's an important way, and we can argue about this at lunch. I think that's an important way that they're different. I think an important lesson that the OER movement can learn from open source software comes back to what you're talking about with Linux in terms of like IBM's contributions to Linux or Google or Facebook's use of open source. The open source world took some time, and really OERs is kind of a decade behind open source. You can see us tripping over the same things, learning some of the same lessons. There was a time at which there was a lot of discomfort in the open source world with the idea that somebody as big as IBM, who's a commercial player, would come into open source because they're going to corrupt it somehow, obviously, because they're a commercial player, because commercial players are all evil. And everybody knows that, and we should hate them and want to keep them out of our club. But it turns out that, I was just looking at these numbers the other day, it turns out that IBM has contributed something like $1 billion and 200 million lines of code or something to Linux development, right? I think in the OER space, we're still very, very uncomfortable with the idea that anybody who's a for-profit might be involved in our space, because by being a commercial player, they're a bad actor because they only love money and they're evil. But if you look at the open source ecosystem, you take out IBM's contributions, take out Google's contributions, take out whoever you want to look at, that is a much poorer, worse off world. And I think as OER continues to mature and move forward, I think that you'll see that there will be commercial players who will get involved, who will obey community norms, and will be actually good, positive contributors. And for most of us, our heads just aren't there yet. We still kind of fight back against that idea that there might be good, positive contributions to be made by commercial players, which is something that open source people have already figured out. And maybe that's enough to say for now. Who's going to take the mic next? Or maybe I just get to dismiss you for lunch. Thank you for coming. Please go to lunch.